There's a moment just before the final ball of the World Cup where the cameras have a close-up on Suzie Bates. And she's smiling in the way that you do when you realize that the job isn't done, but the actual hard work and everything else is finished. There is no way you can lose. She knew that she was just about to win a World Cup. Bates is an absolute legend of cricket. She has played more games than any other woman, and she has been a great batter and at times a phenomenal captain, and she occasionally bowls as well. There is almost no job that Suzie Bates hasn't done for New Zealand, even having to go to the Olympics and play basketball and guard Diana Taurasi. Like, think about the hardest things you have to do in women's sports. Go up against the USA basketball team and the Australian cricket team. And she's done all that, and she's become one of the best batters in the world, despite the fact that New Zealand has never allowed her to play a test match, which is a remarkable thing. So many other players in this World Cup have been able to play some test matches, and Suzie Bates is going to be remembered as a legend, and she has played 0 of them. Not only that, like many players in this World Cup, she came from the amateur era. Now, the only thing was that Suzie Bates never really noticed that she was amateur. She always thought about herself as a professional, and she trained as hard and prepared as hard as possible. Then when the money came in, that was almost like a bonus to her. It allowed her to play for a few more years without her having to worry about going and getting a proper job. She went off and she became a franchise star. But she became that largely because at the same point that money came into cricket, the New Zealand side started to slip. In 2009 and 2010, they were good enough to be in the World Cup finals. Since then, they've been a pretty poor side, and Suzie Bates has had to watch as so many other teams leapfrogged New Zealand. But that's what the smile was about, right? She realized that just for one moment, she gets to sit on top. And not just of all those other teams that leapfrogged her, but Australia as well. Coming into this tournament, everyone thought this was Australia's World Cup. Well, now and forever, it is New Zealand's. And that's why Suzie Bates was so happy. Support us on Patreon and help us keep making our content. Join for exclusive perks like the AMAs, the live calls, and to chat with me directly on Discord. You can also enjoy ad-free content, early podcasts, and access to my emailer. I've been following this World Cup closely, so when the final came about, I was like, I really understand these two teams. And it was interesting because essentially, it was weakness going up against weakness and strength going up against strength. And New Zealand's biggest problem in this tournament is they hadn't made a lot of runs so far. Their bowlers had bailed them out time and time again, but they hadn't really managed to put that much scoreboard pressure on anyone outside of the first game. But because that had been successful, just assume that that is what New Zealand would do again, right? Knock the ball around, get themselves in a good position, and hope that Sophie Devine and the tail can put on enough runs at the end. That is not what New Zealand did here. What they actually went about was more like, I don't know, Muhammad Ali rumble in the jungle. They were leading with their right hand. They decided to come out swinging. That is a high-risk strategy in a World Cup because 2 wickets in the first over and who knows what would have happened to New Zealand. But instead, we saw boundaries, we saw runs, and it was really clear early on that South Africa didn't know what to do to slow them down. And when Bates was asked about all this afterwards, she said, we allowed ourselves to play with freedom. And that's so interesting because we hadn't seen that all the way through the series. And that kind of attitude, when you're trying to change the way that your team has been playing, it usually has to be done by senior players, right? Because the junior players don't always feel as confident to go out there and be that reckless. And so Suzie Bates showing that she was just going to try and whack the ball was a huge change. And have a look at what happened at the other end. Georgia Plimmer, who when she was in England could not find a run. I mean, the New Zealand team has been in bad form for a long time. But when you were watching Plimmer bat not that long ago, you were wondering if New Zealand had just made a massive error. In this World Cup, she's probably been their best bat. And specifically, she went hard at South Africa at the top and changed their plans because of how well she struck the ball. But while New Zealand haven't been doing this all the way through, the reason that they can do this is because they have a couple of top batters coming in next. Amelia Kerr actually hasn't batted all that well throughout this tournament. It hasn't been her best from that point of view. But in this game, given a little bit of a head start by the openers and the fact that Suzie Bates kept going, and eventually Halliday would come in and join her as well, just allowed Amelia Kerr to completely control this innings and make sure that there wasn't going to be a low score. Her strike rate wasn't that impressive, and despite Suzie Bates' early strikes as well, her strike rate wasn't impressive. But their intent was, and what they also did between those two players, is make sure that there was a lot of runs out there and people could attack from the other end. And when Halliday finally comes off, Amelia Kerr suddenly has enough runs to bowl to. And that's really important because while she hasn't been good with the bat in this tournament, She has been the best bowler in this tournament. Australia could not pick her wrong in the game that they went up against. She's just been sliding the ball through, getting people to miss it. And when Deandra Dottin was hitting sixes everywhere and looked like West Indies were going to be in this final, it was Amelia Kerr who got her out again. Almost at every time they've needed Amelia Kerr to be good, she has been. Today, after Leah Tahuhu did her best Liam Plunkett impression, just whacked the ball into the pitch again and again and bowled a great over, the next one was Amelia Kerr, and the wicket that they needed was Laura Wolfart. And of course she got it, because that is what she does. Time and time again in this World Cup, when they needed a wicket, Amelia Kerr got one. And that was it, that wicket. Because they could bat around Laura Wolfart. But the problem for South Africa was that none of their batters outside the top four had really faced any balls. In fact, their specialist wicketkeeper had not faced a ball before this final. They just didn't have the batting available to them once Wolfart went out. And while they looked like the better team in this World Cup than New Zealand, when it came down to it, New Zealand played to their absolute maximum. And South Africa bowled wides. They didn't field particularly well. They probably didn't bowl enough cutters. And they needed to be saved by their top four again. And Amelia Kerr didn't let that happen. And this is a team in transition. And so this team has Mayer and Carson and Jonas. Not exactly the biggest names in women's cricket, not even the biggest names in New Zealand women's cricket. And of recent times, they have really been struggling. We have covered them a lot on our live channel, just saying that we don't know where the future of New Zealand women's cricket is because their team was so dependent on Amelia Kerr, on Sophie Devine, and on Susie Bates. And two of those players are moving on a little bit. And they came into this World Cup with 10 losses. And not just 10 losses, they didn't look like a particularly strong team for a long period of time. It was hard to see what their strength was going to be in this World Cup. The batting wasn't particularly deep. Leah Tahuhu, who's been an incredible servant for New Zealand women's cricket, was no longer bowling with the new ball. Amelia Kerr's recent form hadn't been all that special. And of course, they were going up against one of the favourites in the first game. And they got themselves in a bit of trouble with the bat. And then Sophie Devine just went absolutely nuts. She got them to a score that realistically, until this final, was probably the best batting effort they put in all tournament long. And in all the other games, they were under par. But their bowlers kept standing up, and that's why they got through to the finals. And even though they didn't make enough run in the semi-final, it was their bowlers again who got them over the line. But it's also worth saying that things kind of went their way. For instance, they're not usually a particularly good team when they go up against Australia. If they're ordinary against other teams sometimes, they're much worse than that when they play the Aussies. The fact that they didn't have to play Australia in the final was absolutely massive. And not only that, they also didn't have to play England in the semi-final. The tournament just opened up for them. And even then, they still had to grit and grind to get through. There was a time, even in this game, where South Africa looked like they were back on top. But almost at every single turn of this tournament, when they needed something, they found it. And that's what happened in this final. And in the end, it wasn't even close. They went probably about 15 runs ahead of par, and South Africa never even got close to par. And so here we are, and they are the World Cup champions. And there is a moment just after the game finishes where Sophie Devine is standing in the field, walking really, really slowly, crying, as her friend and her teammate and the person who's been through everything with her, Susie Bates, comes over, and they just meet in the middle of the ground, and they are both in tears on each other. I have to imagine, as optimistic as both of those players are, as talented as they both are, they had to think that this had gone. Their chance to actually win a World Cup, with Australia being so dominant, with India on the rise, with England's great side, even with South Africa regularly making finals, that they had to think that this was probably their last World Cup, or at least one of their last World Cups. And with their form coming in, there was no chance. And that is what you saw. It was almost a lack of belief that Susie Bates and Sophie Devine were World Cup winners. And I can't think of two other cricketers who've done this kind of work for their nation who deserve it any more than them. In fact, let me just take you back to the semi-final, where New Zealand were well on top, and then Deandra Dottin made that game very interesting. But New Zealand got rid of Dottin thanks to Kerr. However, it meant that New Zealand needed to defend 15 runs off the last over. And so with all that bowling talent on the field, who did they throw the ball to? Susie Bates, who hadn't bowled in like the last 22 or 23 T20 games for New Zealand. And they weren't just getting her to bowl any over. They gave Susie Bates the ball because they know her character and her intelligence, and that she was going to help them get over the line. And that first ball, she gets hit for 4. And there's that moment of, no, please let it not be Susie Bates. It was the reason that they don't make this final. And of course, she then tears up the rest of the over, and West Indies go home and New Zealand go into this final. There is simply nothing that New Zealand cricket have not asked of Suzie Bates, and she has been stepping up for years. And the only difference today is that when Suzie Bates stood up, she helped give her country a World Cup win. But there is one way that the country can help Suzie Bates and Sophie Devine and all the other players who won this World Cup. None of them have ever played a test match. Suzie Bates may be the best cricketer ever not to have played a test match. These New Zealand women have just given their nation a trophy. It is time for their nation to make sure that they get a test match. I have a book out with Abhishek Mukherjee, and it is called Overthrowing Cricket's Empire. And it's about the stories of how each team beat England for the first time. We go all the way back to the demon Fred Spofforth getting annoyed at W.G. Grace for acting a little bit like Alex Carey. And then we come all the way to present times with Rashid Khan's England's redemption. We cover every single team to beat England in a major international, but we also talk about the incredible stories, like the barefoot basher from Fiji that almost played for New Zealand. In fact, this book is full of tales like that, like how Pakistan lost a top batter after he was on the run from an angry husband of a movie star he was having an affair with, and also how one future captain of his nation realised he might have to go out and bat at Lords and that he didn't own his own pads. Cricket was used as a tool by the Empire, but what happens when those nations grow up and get good at it? Find Overthrowing Cricket's Empire on Amazon today.